Morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's early out where you are.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here and thanks for having me.
Always. Kendra knows this, but for our audience, Brent and I went to Rotman School of Management together and both had at least a casual interest, but Brent took it all the way when it came to the search funder post MBA journey. And we have invited him, and he's been so kind as to agree to talk to him about that journey. And the way that we're framing it is pre-sale, so the activities leading up to that acquisition, and then post-sale. How do you take that mid-size enterprise and steer it successfully to the future? So Brent, I wonder if you can give our audience an introduction about yourself and your business.
Sure. So my background is actually in electrical contracting and construction. Owned and operated a business in that space for about 12 years. Then I was looking for a change. I was in Western Canada and moved out east to do my MBA program, but also just kind of see a wider variety of industries and experiences. And at that program is where I learned about the search fund space. So not through any courses like at other programs necessarily, but just through being involved in the community, in the entrepreneurship and venture capital space is where I learned about it. And that's where I really fell in love with it. It's a great mix between, the startup world, I think, a little different than startups, but also, the operating world where the rubber really meets the road, and you've got to build things maybe a little bit more sustainably. So that's where I learned about the space. Did my research, and then I found a business partner to pursue the search with. We ended up raising over that summer. Search for about a year, acquired 6 months later, and now we've been operating a great business in the business services space, doing plumbing and HVAC for high-rise condo buildings for the last year. So it's been a lot of fun. Search is a great community that I think is very supportive and just a lot of fun to be in.
We've definitely experienced that. I have introduced Kendra to the searchfunder.com platform, and we were amazed by just the quality and amount of information you could find there.
Yeah, it's incredible, actually. The number of searchers and the people that are involved. It's a very different community than you might expect, but super helpful, super supportive. There's lots of great podcasts out there as well, from industry investors and that type of thing. So, not hard to learn about.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say supportive was the key word that I took away from the platform. And that's really nice to see, especially as you're going through this process, to have the support of people who have been there before or people who are experiencing the same things as you, so that you have some camaraderie through the process. So it's great to hear that you experienced that too.
That's right. That's right.
There's just so much to learn and to know about operating a business. Kendra and I, independently, but now more collaboratively, serve the mid-size enterprise space in Canada. These are businesses that have subject matter expertise. They know a lot about quite a few things, but they certainly don't know everything. They don't know necessarily how or in what way they could exit, for example. They also don't know how they might acquire a business and grow through acquisition. And, the finance on paper stuff is one thing, but the qualitative human side of things is another. And that's really where Kendra and I overlap the most, is taking that human lens to business and seeing opportunities for more success. As a icing on the cake on top of all that, like hard financial legwork that gets done as well, which I think is a good segue into your pre-sale journey, Brent. You said that you spent a year searching. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the companies that you were looking at and considering.
Yeah, I mean, we were looking far and wide, literally. So we were looking across the US and Canada. The majority of our investor base was in the US. But we also saw a large opportunity, in a larger market as well. So our search consisted with going from basically one industry niche to the next, as we searched for what is well known in the search community, as a kind of down the fairway type search business, which has, some of the characteristics like strong recurring revenue, growth, strong margins, all things that work really well in this model that's been executed upon now for, probably close to 40 years. So, spent our time searching both from a proprietary perspective, doing outbound emails, phone calls. We even did some mailings at one time that didn't work as well as we expected. But every searcher seems to have their own unique approach. So that's one thing I've certainly learned in the space is, one thing that worked for us was not necessarily what worked for others, and vice versa. Yeah, I conducted a great search, put down a number of offers, but then ultimately found a great business that we were comfortable acquiring into the space.
Awesome. Now, you mentioned you looked at both Canada and the US. Were there any clear differences between those targets?
Yeah, I would say our approach from the start was to look at the US market. We thought that, given higher deal activity, that it would be a little easier to have some of those first conversations and get things moving a little quicker. I think that's certainly how it played out. There were also some other interesting things that came up. Um, but conversations were quicker, more to the point, and we found, people were a little more ready to have those conversations and had potentially thought a little bit more about selling their business, which is always helpful. I think in the search process, when you're acquiring, one of the most important things is that, the business owner has some kind of an advisor on their side that understands how to get a business sold and what people are looking for. Otherwise, you're having to do a little more heavy lifting, which is not to say you don't do the acquisition or don't go down that road if they don't have that person. But anyways, yeah, that's why we looked at the U.S. market. I think we were able to learn more, and move more quickly through some of the niches that we wanted to look at, and kind of get further down our acquisition journey. And then we turned our focus to the Canadian market and searched both markets at the same time.
I am so interested to know, in the Canadian market, when you started looking, and obviously you've brought up one thing is readiness and just that thinking, what we mentioned before about, like, do they have a plan? Do they know that this is an option in terms of exit? I think you've defined that pretty well in terms of the stage of readiness of Canadian versus US private enterprises. I wonder, just looking at Canada, the green flags versus red flags that you saw when you were evaluating these companies. I'm sure after a year, there were a few that, got rejected. Maybe that's a harsh word, but ruled out quickly. I know that's actually a principle of a search funder approach is, look for some things that rule out your options. So I wonder if you could tell us about the ruling out and also the bringing them in, being more attracted to these targets.
Yeah, I mean, and whatever you want to call that, rejected, filtering, I think it's just good for both sides because you really are looking for that motivation to sell. You definitely, don't want to be spending too much time for a business owner. They're very, very busy people, and you don't want to be burning up more of their time than you need to if you can both kind of see that something's not going to work out for whatever reason. And sometimes that's just a matter of the search model versus what they might be looking for in an exit. Maybe it's the size of the business, just simple things that, where it doesn't fit. So you want to move on quickly. So, I mean, I guess starting, at the beginning or the top of our funnel, call it for lack of a better term, we'd be looking for some of those obvious things, the wrong size that, a company maybe can't support dual searchers, or even searchers at all, maybe pre-profitability. There are certainly some search deals that are done in that pre-profitability stage, but it certainly just adds more risk. in a model that usually, looks for something a little different than that. So, looking for some of those things. Motivation to sell is obviously a big one. We've got advisors lined up. We've got capital ready to go. Most searchers have either quit their jobs or are very focused on this full time. So, we want to be moving through something quickly. Not to say that we won't have a conversation for the longer term. There's many search deals that I've heard of as well where the conversation comes back up a year later, 10 months down the road, whatever it might be, because they've had a good relationship, but the owner just wasn't, ready to sell at that point for whatever reason. But it's good to know, for someone who's looking to sell their business, that searchers are ready with the capital, with the advisors wanting to do a deal, because that's kind of the worst thing is if you get down that road, that conversation, maybe spend some money, and can't close a deal or something like that. So at the top, we'd kind of look for some of those basics. Once we got a little further, maybe we've looked at their financials, had some more conversations together, maybe even met someone else in the business that they're open to sharing that conversation with. Then we'd start to look at what we considered the big three, which were revenue, quality, growth, and strong margins. And I think probably most searchers, if you ask them, will say something similar, but that's what works well for the model. So I'll maybe start with growth, which is something that we'd look for a history of, sustainable growth. I remember we were looking at an IT services firm, very sticky business, hard to kind of rip and replace IT services from your client. So it's very sticky, which is fantastic. But on the flip side, a little harder to grow, right? Because essentially, unless you have, new startup businesses or something like that, you're trying to replace another IT services firm. So that was, something that we'd look for in terms of the growth aspect. What products or services might be growing when you look a little more detailed at their financials. It might look great at the top line that things are growing, but maybe it's all attributed to a product or a service that you might not be comfortable, in the larger kind of macro sense. And even that it's profitable growth. So in the search space, we're definitely looking for that sustainable business that has the profitability characteristics to fund future growth and generate returns for investors at the end of the day.
That's such an interesting point about the stickiness being great, but then also a downside. If I'm going to take over this business with the intent of growing it further, what's that ceiling or what am I up against here? I wonder, would you ever, speaking to the IT services industry, because that's certainly, that's why we called it PreSale, PostSale. Kendra and I have played in that space. I used to work for the company that acquired Nortel when they went under. So certainly very familiar with that space in Canada. And I wonder whether it would have changed your mind or your perception of the business's potential if, say, they had metrics to show that they were actually particularly good at displacing. There's certainly a wide range of service quality out there. Sometimes I think Canadian businesses who rely on IT service companies, they just don't know what they don't know. And they're really just looking for someone to fix their network that keeps going down or their phone system that doesn't work. And they're not necessarily doing a lot of due diligence around that. I wonder if those metrics would have changed your mind, a business's ability to acquire new customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guarantee there's businesses out there that do a great job of that, that are, growing at a higher rate than maybe the average or the mean across that industry. I don't have any specific examples in that space, but the business that we acquired into doing HVAC and plumbing, again, great retention of clients, property managers, that is, and strata councils. The buildings that we work in, you've got to have the building knowledge. There's a lot of things that help kind of keep us in the building, and that's also beneficial for our clients, that we know where things are. how to perform different services within the building that someone new incoming might not see. And so, having that is sticky, but you might ask, well, what does growth look like? In this case, after a couple years, a new building comes off its warranty from the original contractor. And so that's what we would look at for new growth prospects, which then you look at the new buildings coming onto the market. What does that growth look like? What does the greater real estate market look like? Of course, we're in Vancouver, which is defined by mountains to the north, the U.S. border to the south, and the Pacific Ocean to the west. So you've got to go up in a lot of cases. So that certainly helps in our case. And I'm sure there's a parallel in the IT services space to kind of, show that growth is certainly doable on the flip side of that sword.
Yeah, it's an interesting space because it can be impacted wildly, like things like COVID, because suddenly the work from home technology that was put off for so long was suddenly like urgent.
That's right.
But then that goes away. So you can have this really attractive couple of years, signing people up for a 3-year support contract. But then if you dig deeper, those contracts are coming up. Will they be renewed? And on the flip side, who else has customers whose contracts are coming up that are not happy with their service that we could be that, slide in there. So there's something about those moments in time that certainly influence the attractiveness.
Yeah, exactly. And we actually started searching right when COVID hit. So we can all remember ourselves and our situations when that happened, kind of unnerving, not sure what the future looked like. And we looked at a remote education software business, which seemed great at the time. I actually don't know how they're doing now. They might be doing very well, but just kind of relating that to a more broader trend that we've seen, in some of the software that boomed through COVID is, some has kind of come back and others have been able to maintain that growth. So that's something, that you definitely want to be cognizant of, depending on the economic cycle or the shock or whatever's happening at that time that you might be searching within. So yeah, growth was certainly a big thing that we looked for. Strong margins and recurring revenue are the other big ones. Recurring revenue, the benefit of that is just for a searcher transitioning into the business, it helps de-risk and kind of cushion that transition. It also helps you budget more easily and kind of manage and plan your growth. In terms of assessing that, when you're looking at a company, you talk about green flags. That's certainly, you're looking at the data to understand what type of recurring revenue they might have on the spectrum from, completely contractual recurring revenue all the way to completely transactional, where they're just here to make a purchase and I may see you next time or not. So trying to understand what that looks like, but also tie that into the story about the business. So the more qualitative side, I think that's really where the magic is. The human side of things, which can be messy, of course, but does that story that they're telling you kind of match up with the data? And in our case, in the HVAC and plumbing space, we like to call it predictable revenue. So we do have contracts that recur, annual auto renew, but there are out clauses. But the work is not discretionary and it's got to be taken care of. We're talking about leaks, kitchen sink backups,
Right.
Heating not working, cooling, that type of thing. And so you see that predictability, that people keep coming back for the service. So you've obviously got to make sure that you're delivering a high quality of service, showing up on time when you say you will, that type of thing. But that's the type of thing that we were looking for when we were searching, and certainly found, in our business.
And actually, that brings me to the last question I'll ask, and then I'll hand over the mic to Kendra, which is really around that reputation and goodwill, an extremely qualitative, vague thing to get at. People have different approaches. And of course, the business owner is going to make their case on how well respected and appreciated their business that they've built is. I wonder how you approached or thought about that in your search.
Yeah, that's a that's a great point, and I just want to underscore that point because I think that's something that's incredibly important in our business, especially with the clients that we have, property managers, and the relationships that we have in those buildings. It's like a little community within a condo building. The other service providers and things like that. So it's extremely important. From the search perspective, I think again, it's connecting the story that they're telling you with some of the data that you might see under the hood. So really drilling into an example that someone might give you. I'll give one example. We were very interested in the building services space, a roofing company, and they had fantastic margins, much better margins than we would see with other roofing companies in commercial, in the commercial space. And so we were trying to figure that out, through looking at some of the financial information. Turns out they outsourced a lot of their engineering and some of the kind of information processing and back office work that they do. So that's how they were able to lower the cost, but they still had, undergrad engineering type quality personnel providing that information for their clients and for their field staff. So it matched up with the business owner's understanding of the client's needs, which he seemed to know incredibly well. What they liked, what they didn't like, how they wanted things done. So just kind of connecting those two, I think, helps verify, or validate, what your owner is trying to tell you.
That is music to my ears. I frequently think about all the ways in which, as human beings, we come across like, I don't understand why that person behaves the way that they do. And that could be your spouse. That could be the person that apparently you know better than anyone else. And yet suddenly when you're in business and you've been operating it for 20 years, and I understand why, it's like, oh, I know exactly what my customers are thinking. But do you really know what they're thinking? And sometimes, yes, if you've done that legwork, but changing times, pre-COVID, post-COVID, just the natural order of culture evolution, I think it's less common for a business owner to have that depth of understanding of their customers.
That's right. But when you can see someone kind of execute on that, the client's looking for lower costs. So, to really go out of your way and execute on that, then that shows that they really understand and care to make that change.
Totally. It's almost always going out of your way. You'd rather not do the change.
That's right.
Yeah.
We're behavioral beings.
Yes, we really are. We're weirdos. I'll pass it off to Kendra.
Yeah. I mean, Brent, you touched on some really interesting points there. And I know we're focusing mainly on the post acquisition, but I had one question that I wanted to just circle back to when you were speaking about assessing a business and all of the businesses you were looking at. And you mentioned obviously growth and recurring revenue, but from your perspective, what kind of internal factors, maybe the more intangible things, were you looking at in terms of the respect, the loyalty? I know we can measure turnover internally within the team, but what were some of those factors that were maybe a little bit harder to distinguish for you when you were assessing these businesses to acquire?
Yeah, great question. I would probably focus on the people side of things, which is an incredibly important component of the entire business, of course, as we all know. And that's hard to dig under the hood until you can actually have conversations with those people. You certainly can gauge that to some extent from the owner or seller that you're speaking with. And in all cases that I was involved in, I don't know if I came across any cases that they were always very upfront, transparent, and open with you, offering up any challenges, after you'd had a number of conversations that may be going on, But there are just so many intangibles that are hard to understand until you meet that person who runs the product side, maybe the accounting side of things. Until you meet them and understand their challenges and what they're working through, really hard to know. So that was more of a black box that until you got further down, due diligence, further down the line where the owner was comfortable with having you speak to some other folks within the business. I think that was a tricky one to understand.
Absolutely. And I know I threw you a bit of a curveball there, but I think you answered that perfectly. And that's what I've heard in terms of acquisitions too, that there is no real answer, perfect answer, right? Because we are behavioral beings, as we know. And there's a little bit of sometimes irrationality, especially around that time, I'm sure, with COVID and uncertainty, and change brings about certain reactions that are either very positive or a little not so positive in nature, where people are concerned about their jobs. We're seeing a lot of layoffs these days, right? Because obviously labor is one of the first things that gets considered when we're looking at financials and whatnot. So in speaking about, you don't really know until you get under the hood and you meet all of these people. What was kind of that introductory and that change management process for you? When did you really get to look under the hood? And when would you maybe advise that people start to have those conversations, so long as the business owner is comfortable?
Yeah, so I kind of shifting now to the post-sale side of things. I mean, that in retrospect and in reflection, I love how my business partner Jody put it. It just felt like you were operating in a fog for the first, call it, couple of months, even. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, because you don't know what you don't know. At that point, you come in with a lot of obviously your own perspective that's informed by conversations that you have directly with the business owners, by looking at financials, by maybe studying the space. Maybe you've talked to a few clients or some of the employees, but not many of them. So it's a very different perspective than the business owner has, from 20 or 30 years of understanding their clients, of understanding their employees, their challenges, all of that. So it's incredibly important to not make decisions, at least big ones, early on, I think, and just get to understand all the different parts of the business. Once you start to get an understanding and you're settling in, then I think it's also gauging people within the org and how comfortable they are with you, because they're also trying to understand how you do things, if you do what you say you will, how the things you do turn out, all of those things. So once you start getting that level of comfort, then you can start to make some of those changes that we're all certainly eager to make at the start, because obviously you buy a great business, and you want to build upon that solid foundation, and so those changes are things you want to implement. I think for us, one of the biggest things that we did early on, kind of after that maybe 2-month period, was start to think about and implement an operating system. So that was one of our biggest initiatives, but it just took time to kind of get through that fog period and get to understand and get settled in, make sure everyone's comfortable with you, I think, before you make too many big changes.
That's an excellent point, and very rooted in respect, which I appreciate. As you mentioned, you're usually eager to get in there, and just like in a new space, anything, you need to give it time to settle and see what fits and what might not fit. So I really appreciate that approach. And I think that that's something, for me, that's a key takeaway, that you need to settle in, don't make decisions right away, especially where internal operations and people are concerned, because you're ultimately under a microscope at the beginning, right? People are really paying attention to what you're doing.
Yeah, I think everyone feels like that, right? Both sides. So it's just this uncomfortable situation, and so it's important just to make those human connections, grab a coffee, out for lunch, work through a challenge, so that people are more open and just comfortable around one another, because these are people that you just met, a whole group of people that you just met. So
Absolutely. And in that, as you're kind of driving that change and meeting people one by one, were there certain people that you found to be the most impactful to get on board right away? To really have us kind of change champions within the organization to help spread that change and almost the sense of comfort that comes along with change?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know that we did this deliberately, but in hindsight, I think it's much more clear when you ask that question. And it's really the people that you can see that are respected, well by others. They they have been around for a long time in most cases, but also just understand the challenges that people face in different parts of the business. And so, they might understand to ask the question, well, what's on your plate before handing you a new job or a new task or something like that. So making those connections early is just, helpful from a network perspective and an effectiveness perspective, because you only have so much time in a day, so many things that you can accomplish. So it's helpful to get those people on board first. But again, I don't think that was deliberate. I think that was something we kind of fumbled into or understood, after the fact.
Absolutely. And observing, right? Taking that time to settle in allows that to be clear too, as you start to kind of come out of the fog. So that's really interesting that it was a bit of a hindsight moment for you to realize that. And kudos for doing it unintentionally, because I think there are a lot of folks who don't necessarily take that approach right away. So it's really great to hear. And from your perspective going in, I mean, we've talked about some of the things that were a little uncertain from your side, but as coming in and inquiring, were there any points of friction that you didn't anticipate internally from a team perspective that maybe you would want anybody in their search to have line of sight of?
Good question. Yeah, there were certainly things. I'm trying to think of specifics to highlight here that would be interesting for someone transitioning in. I think a lot of it could just be, that comfort with opening up and having that dialogue. And until you've built that relationship, it's certainly a daunting thing to come and talk to someone who's just transitioned into the business, not someone who's hired you, but is your new boss essentially.
Mhm.
So just finding ways to open that up, I think is a good, reflection from our perspective, giving people the opportunity to bring things up in multiple ways. And the space to do so. Sometimes it's just getting out of the office. But I would say, that's one thing that I've learned is there's certainly more happening than you can fully understand. So finding those ways to open up conversations and help people feel that they can discuss those issues or challenges that they're working through with you early on would be really helpful.
Awesome. Excellent. A lot of communication, transparency, I've heard. And it sounded like when in the pre-acquisition conversation, you mentioned integrity inadvertently,
Yes.
right? Are we showing up on time? Are we completing the work? And I think these are all values that maybe, sure, we talk about values, we see them on walls in different organizations and things like that. But when you're explaining these things and having these conversations, it's nice to see that those values are being lived. There's action surrounding them. And I guess so then my last question for you would be, in terms of looking for a business, in terms of the acquisition and then the post sale and really drawing out those values, how important is that value work, is reiterating that to the team, and making sure that there's action-based drivers to the things that we're saying we're doing, and measuring those and comparing them?
Yeah, I'll maybe step back and include, I think, what you're talking about, values based thinking in maybe a wider perspective. One of the changes that we implemented after we got through that fog was this operating system. There are many out there. I think it's just important to choose one. So one component of what's called the vision component in EOS, if any listeners are familiar with it, is this core values, along with 7 other questions that should be answered and kind of shared by all. I think the right approach that came from EOS is to start with some traction components first. So to try to introduce some tools where people can see some action and some solid outcomes earlier on, and then start to get to some of the visioning exercises, the core values, and things like that. It also gives you time to see how your team operates optimally, effectively, and those types of things. So starting with some of the traction pieces, which for us was just getting into a regular meeting cadence. There were no meetings in the company when we transitioned in. So decisions would still happen quickly, people bouncing from office to office, but you could imagine that would just slow people down with the interruptions and things like that. And then the story might change or the decision might change as it goes around. So just getting on a regular meeting cadence, understanding some of the main priorities for the quarter, or for that week, even having that structure in place before you start to switch into the vision and the values, which I think you highlight a very important point, because personally, from my perspective, I always like to think about these values, because at the end of the day, that's what gives us a North Star. That's what drives us. And everyone's got their own personal values, whether they've sat down and deliberately listed them, thoughtfully themselves, or whether they just have them, built up through their years of experience. And those values will inevitably conflict in decision making in the organization. And so if you don't have a clear set of values, I say it on the wall, but we don't have them on the wall, but to kind of point to and say, well, that's how we're going to make this decision based on those values that we agreed on previously. Then it becomes very difficult to make that decision. Otherwise, you're working within your own personal values, and there will continually be conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. There were some incredible takeaways, and thank you for answering that. That was perfect and exactly what I was looking for. Even the process, right? Some of the structural things that you came in and had to implement, different ways of making decision, what could provoke conflict. So I really appreciate those key takeaways there. But definitely communication, transparency, and observing were some of those key takeaways for me. So thank you.
Absolutely. So Brent, I know being a CEO of a growing mid-sized enterprise, you have things to do with that business. I'm sure the work never ends. I wonder, I've heard things about, for example, implementing tools that this Canadian enterprise did not previously have. That could be something that some people see as a difference between Canada and US. It can also be the empathy that you had for your team that maybe they weren't used to. I wonder, I'm mixing two things here. I'm definitely interested in the Canada versus US. You always understand things as what they are based on what they are not. And I'm also very interested in like the sort of current generation who's leading these businesses versus the new generation, such as yourself, who are taking the helm now, because millennials aren't young anymore. We're old, actually, and it's our time to shine. So I wonder, just in these sort of before and after, or US versus Canada, has anything occurred to you in terms of Canadian business culture? We're talking about values a lot. What are Canadians used to in your mind, or not used to, based on your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess my mind immediately goes to comparing with our neighbors south of the border, but there's obviously a lot of other countries out there to compare to, and I think back to some comments from our implementer for our operating system, who has been incredibly helpful with our team, both to help us implement this system, but also to kind of hold up this mirror and show you what you are saying or what you're doing, or what the team is doing, and help correct and kind of mentor, either individually or with the team. And one of the great comments, she's Australian, is just kind of, in a group of Canadians, like, just come out and say it,
Yeah.
just be more direct, tell us what you're thinking. And so I think that's probably the difference I've seen, even early on in our search, speaking with US-based business owners. For better or for worse, I can think of, scenarios where this isn't helpful, and where it is, of course, but just more direct and candid, open conversations with our neighbors south of the border. And that's the kind of the main aspect of my experiences with US business owners. But it's just more of that direct approach to communication.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Brent, I'm sure I speak for Kendra where we would love to talk to like your employees and your customers post acquisition. What's the like now versus what it was, right? Like it sounds like you guys have just really hit the ground running even after that period of fog and learning. And of course, are positioned for success in beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia. So we're so grateful for you to come in and share your wisdom and your experience with us today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and hopefully this is helpful for your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it will be.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been helpful for us.